I try to deal with it now. Like, I really don't care no more. Like, that's how I feel. I don't care anymore. I don't care who feel nothing about my baby. I don't care.
You say that Ms. Baker and her family's public denial of this child has caused you pain. He was killed 3 months after the birth of this child, of Ms. Hooker's baby, and you are here to put the lies to rest. Is that correct?
It just seemed like everybody else looking upside my head like I'm an animal or something. Like, every time I'm sitting down doing something, they looking at me like I'm just... First, we was best friends. 6th grade year, we was best friends, and then we started talking. Then we stopped talking, and just like we stopped talking. We always talk, but we just stopped going together. But we still talking though, but we just stopped going together. Like, we weren't boyfriend or girlfriend.
Okay, but then you still talked.
Yeah.
Were you in love, or was this was your first love?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kenaya, it's her family who makes my daughter feel some type of way. It's not Ms. Baker.
This court case unfolds inside a paternity courtroom overseen by Judge Lauren Lake, where emotions, evidence, and unresolved grief collide. The case is not presented as drama for entertainment, but as a serious examination of how truth operates on the evidence stage in a divorce-like dispute over parentage, identity, and responsibility. At the center of the courtroom is a young mother who arrives seeking clarity, dignity, and recognition for her child, while the opposing family arrives burdened by loss, doubt, and unanswered questions. What begins as a request for proof slowly becomes a broader exploration of the relationship between law and justice. The court first establishes who is present and why they are there. A young woman stands before Judge Lauren Lake claiming that her infant daughter is the biological child of a man who is now deceased. Because the alleged father is no longer alive, his mother and close relatives appear in court to represent his interests. This immediately changes the tone of the case. Unlike typical DNA test cheating stories where both parents are alive, this situation involves grief layered on top of uncertainty. The court must balance empathy with procedure, ensuring that justice is not overshadowed by emotion. Judge Lauren Lake carefully explains that the court is not here to punish or shame anyone, but to determine facts using admissible evidence under the rules of the Evidence Act. The judge makes it clear that this is not about rumors, social media claims, or family opinions. This is about scientific proof and legal standards. The concept of adverse inference in evidence is briefly raised, emphasizing that speculation cannot replace facts, especially when a child's future identity is at stake. As testimony begins, the mother explains her relationship with the deceased man. She describes a bond that existed over time, one that included emotional involvement, physical intimacy, and moments where the alleged father appeared to accept the child as his own. She speaks not with anger, but with fatigue, as someone who has spent months being questioned and judged. Her words echo themes often discussed on platforms like the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where people regret taking DNA tests but still pursue them because uncertainty is more painful than clarity. On the other side, the deceased man's mother explains why doubt exists. She testifies that her son expressed uncertainty before his death and requested that a DNA test be done if possible. Her presence is not hostile. Instead, it reflects a promise she made to her son. She insists that her participation is not meant to harm the child, but to honor her son's request and bring closure. This perspective highlights the difficult balance between emotional loyalty and factual truth, a recurring issue in adoption stories, full episodes, and child support disputes reviewed by higher courts, including principles echoed in Supreme Court child support rulings. Judge Lauren Lake pauses the proceedings at several points to control the courtroom, reminding everyone that heightened emotions cannot derail the process. She explains how the law separates feelings from findings. The court acknowledges that pain exists on all sides, but pain alone cannot determine parentage. This moment reinforces the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where fairness is defined by consistency, not sympathy. The DNA testing method is then explained in detail. Because the alleged father is deceased, the court orders a kinship DNA test using the biological material of the father's parents. This is a legally accepted method when direct testing is impossible. The explanation is clinical, deliberate, and precise, underscoring that this is not entertainment but a formal legal procedure. The judge clarifies that many people regret taking a DNA test, but regret does not invalidate results. Science does not adjust itself to emotional readiness. Before results are read, tensions rise. Family members express frustration about how the situation has affected reputations and relationships. Accusations surface indirectly, touching on themes common in DNA test cheating stories, where loyalty and trust are questioned without concrete proof. Judge Lauren Lake intervenes firmly, explaining that the courtroom is not a place for character assassination. The focus must remain on evidence. When the results are finally presented, the courtroom falls silent. The DNA test establishes that there is no biological relationship between the child and the deceased man's parents. This means, legally and scientifically, the deceased man is not the child's father. The finding is definitive, leaving no room for interpretation. At this moment, the idea that truth changes everything becomes painfully real. The mother is forced to confront a reality she did not expect, while the opposing family experiences a complicated mix of relief, guilt, and sorrow. Judge Lauren Lake addresses the aftermath with care. She reminds everyone that while the DNA test answers the legal question, it does not erase the emotional journey that brought them there. She speaks directly to the broader relationship between law and justice, explaining that the law can determine facts, but healing requires time, accountability, and maturity. This reflection mirrors discussions often found in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal victories are shown to carry emotional consequences beyond the courtroom. The judge also speaks about responsibility moving forward. Even though the child is not biologically related to the deceased man, the child remains innocent. The court encourages respectful boundaries and discourages lingering resentment. This aligns with recovery-focused narratives similar to Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acceptance of truth becomes the first step toward personal rebuilding. The case concludes without celebration. There is no triumphant ending, only resolution. The courtroom empties with heavier hearts but clearer understanding. Judge Lauren Lake adjourns the court by reinforcing that seeking the truth is never wrong, but everyone must be prepared to live with the results. The court has fulfilled its role under the Evidence Act, ensuring that justice is served through facts, not assumptions. This case stands as a powerful example of why DNA tests are both necessary and feared. It illustrates how people regret taking them, yet continue to pursue them because uncertainty corrodes relationships faster than truth ever could. It also demonstrates how courts serve as the final stage where evidence, law, and humanity intersect, shaping outcomes that echo far beyond the courtroom walls. As the courtroom moves forward after the initial DNA revelation, Judge Lauren Lake deliberately reframes the purpose of the proceedings. She reminds everyone present that while the science has spoken, the court's responsibility extends beyond numbers and percentages. This moment becomes a lesson on how the evidence stage in a divorce-like paternity dispute often exposes deeper fractures that existed long before the DNA test was ever ordered. The judge emphasizes that the law does not exist to humiliate or vindicate, but to clarify. In doing so, she reinforces the fragile relationship between law and justice, a relationship often discussed in legal analysis forums and podcasts where outcomes are legally correct but emotionally devastating. The mother remains seated, visibly processing the result. Her silence speaks louder than argument ever could. For months, she believed that proof would finally silence doubts and restore her dignity. Instead, the DNA test has rewritten her narrative entirely. This is one of the harsh realities often explored on platforms like the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where guests describe how people regret taking DNA tests not because the test is wrong, but because the truth forces them to confront consequences they never anticipated. In this courtroom, regret is not dramatic. It is quiet, heavy, and irreversible. Judge Lauren Lake addresses the opposing family next. She acknowledges that while the DNA result confirms the absence of biological ties, it does not erase the grief they have carried since losing their son. The court recognizes that their insistence on testing was not rooted in cruelty, but in a promise made to someone who is no longer alive. This distinction matters legally and morally. The judge explains that honoring such a promise through lawful means is not wrongdoing. It is, in fact, an example of how justice functions when emotion is filtered through procedure, rather than impulse. The courtroom atmosphere remains tense as additional context is discussed. The judge explains how cases like this often lead to misconceptions about moral blame. She clarifies that the court does not determine character, fidelity, or worthiness. Those judgments belong to private conscience, not public record. This is particularly important in cases that resemble DNA test cheating stories, where public opinion often moves faster than verified facts. Judge Lauren Lake warns against turning legal outcomes into personal verdicts, reminding everyone that jurisprudence is concerned with rights and responsibilities, not gossip. Attention then shifts to the legal implications of the result. With no biological link established, the deceased man's family has no legal obligation related to child support, inheritance, or custodial recognition. Judge Lauren Lake explains this carefully, referencing established principles that align with Supreme Court child support precedents. Legal responsibility follows biological or legally adopted ties, not emotional assumptions. This explanation underscores the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where fairness is defined by consistent application of law rather than situational sympathy. However, the judge also addresses a critical misconception. She states that absence of legal obligation does not mandate emotional hostility. The law does not require families to sever compassion. This nuanced point reflects discussions found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where individuals learn to separate boundaries from bitterness. Judge Lauren Lake encourages all parties to leave the courtroom without continuing cycles of blame, emphasizing that unresolved anger often causes more damage than the original dispute. As the case transitions toward closure, Judge Lauren Lake takes time to explain the broader legal framework to the audience. She discusses how kinship DNA testing functions when an alleged father is deceased, and why such tests are admissible under the Evidence Act. This explanation serves an educational purpose, illustrating that the court's decision was not arbitrary but grounded in established scientific and legal standards. She also addresses adverse inference in evidence, noting that refusal to test or reliance on rumors cannot substitute for verified proof. The mother briefly responds, not to argue the result, but to express confusion about how her reality has shifted so quickly. Judge Lauren Lake listens without interruption, reinforcing that the courtroom is a place where voices are heard even when outcomes cannot change. This moment mirrors conversations often found on the Divorce Course podcast, where participants describe how legal closure does not immediately translate into emotional resolution. The judge reassures her that acceptance is a process, not a requirement imposed by the court. The opposing family also speaks, clarifying that their pursuit of the test was never meant to shame or isolate the child. They explain that doubt existed long before the court filing, and that the test was the only way to put speculation to rest. Judge Lauren Lake acknowledges this explanation, noting that unresolved doubt often corrodes relationships more severely than painful truth. This sentiment aligns with themes explored in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where attorneys discuss how decisive evidence, even when unfavorable, allows people to move forward instead of remaining trapped in uncertainty. The judge then broadens the discussion, referencing Adoption Story's full episodes that highlight how parentage is not solely defined by DNA. While biology carries legal weight, caregiving, honesty, and accountability define moral parenthood. Judge Lauren Lake makes it clear that the court cannot assign a new father, rewrite history, or erase emotional bonds. Its role ends with truth determination. What happens afterward depends entirely on the individuals involved. Before adjourning, Judge Lauren Lake delivers a final reflection. She states that many people enter court believing that truth will bring peace instantly. In reality, truth brings clarity, and clarity brings responsibility. This is why so many people regret taking DNA tests yet still pursue them. Without truth, life stalls. With truth, life must change. The court exists to ensure that change is guided by law rather than chaos. As the proceedings conclude, there is no applause, no celebration, and no visible relief. The courtroom empties slowly, carrying with it the weight of a resolved question and many unresolved emotions. Judge Lauren Lake adjourns the session with a reminder that justice has been served according to law, but healing will require patience, maturity, and grace from every person involved. This case stands as a clear example of how the evidence stage in sensitive family disputes can redefine identities and relationships. It demonstrates why the relationship between law and justice must be carefully maintained, why adverse inference cannot replace proof, and why the concept of justice in jurisprudence demands both firmness and restraint. Above all, it shows that while courts can determine facts, they cannot shield anyone from the consequences of truth. As the final phase of the case settles into silence, Judge Lauren Lake takes one last opportunity to contextualize what has unfolded. She explains that cases involving paternity, especially when one alleged parent is deceased, are among the most emotionally complex matters the court faces. Unlike conventional disputes, these cases force people to confront identity, memory, and expectation all at once. The judge reiterates that the courtroom is not designed to decide who loved whom more, or who deserved what emotionally, but to determine truth through lawful means. This distinction once again highlights the delicate relationship between law and justice. The judge speaks directly about why DNA testing is both powerful and feared. In many cases, people regret taking a DNA test because it removes the ability to live within uncertainty. Hope, denial, and assumption often coexist more comfortably than verified facts. This is why so many stories discussed on platforms like the Truth Changes Everything podcast revolve around individuals who pursued answers only to realize that truth reshaped their lives permanently. Judge Lauren Lake reminds everyone that the court does not compel emotional readiness. It only ensures factual accuracy. The mother's journey is revisited, not to reopen wounds, but to clarify the legal record. Judge Lauren Lake notes that coming to court was not a mistake. Seeking clarity through lawful channels is never wrong, even when the outcome is painful. The judge emphasizes that courage is not measured by winning a case, but by facing reality without distortion. This observation mirrors discussions frequently heard on the Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where growth begins not with validation, but with acceptance. Attention then shifts to the broader legal implications of such cases. Judge Lauren Lake explains that family courts across the country follow similar principles when addressing parentage disputes. The Evidence Act governs what can and cannot be considered proof, ensuring that decisions are not swayed by speculation or emotional narratives. The judge explains that adverse inference in evidence is a dangerous shortcut, assuming guilt or responsibility because of silence or absence undermines the fairness of the legal process. Only verifiable evidence, such as DNA results, can establish legal truth. The judge also addresses the public perception surrounding DNA test cheating stories. She notes that society often rushes to assign blame, especially to mothers, without understanding the complexity of relationships or timelines. The courtroom, however, cannot operate on stereotypes. Justice in jurisprudence demands neutrality. The court does not punish perceived moral failure. It resolves legal questions. This distinction protects not only the parties involved, but also the integrity of the legal system itself. As the case nears conclusion, Judge Lauren Lake turns to the child at the center of the dispute, even though the child is too young to understand what has happened. She speaks for the record, stating that the child's worth is not diminished by the absence of a biological link. The court recognizes that identity is more than genetics, but genetics still matter under the law. This dual truth reflects themes commonly explored in adoption stories' full episodes, where legal parenthood, emotional bonds, and personal history intersect in complicated ways. Judge Lauren Lake also briefly discusses the issue of child support, clarifying misconceptions that often arise after such rulings. Because the DNA results exclude the deceased man as the biological father, there is no legal pathway for Supreme Court child support principles to apply to his family. This explanation is delivered carefully, without judgment, reinforcing that financial responsibility follows legal parentage, not assumption or sentiment. The courtroom atmosphere remains subdued as the judge reflects on how people often misunderstand the purpose of court. Many believe the courtroom exists to deliver emotional closure, apologies, or moral vindication. In reality, the court delivers answers. What individuals do with those answers determines whether healing occurs. This idea is frequently discussed on the Divorce Course podcast, where legal resolution is described as the beginning of emotional work, not the end of it. Judge Lauren Lake acknowledges that some people leave court feeling worse than when they arrived. That does not mean justice failed. It means the truth was difficult. She explains that the law cannot protect people from emotional pain without compromising fairness. The court's obligation is to clarity, not comfort. This perspective aligns with discussions on the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal professionals emphasize that ethical advocacy prioritizes truth over favorable optics. Before formally adjourning the case, Judge Lauren Lake issues a final reminder to everyone involved. She urges them not to let this ruling define future interactions with cruelty or resentment. While the law has determined that there is no biological relationship, the court does not order hostility or disrespect. The judge encourages all parties to leave the courtroom with restraint, dignity, and a commitment to move forward without perpetuating harm. The gavel comes down softly, signaling the end of the proceedings. There is no dramatic reaction, no collective sigh of relief. Instead, there is a quiet understanding that something irreversible has occurred. The evidence stage has done its work. The truth has been spoken clearly, without embellishment or compromise. As people exit the courtroom, the lasting lesson of the case becomes apparent. This was never just about a DNA test. It was about how truth operates within the legal system and how individuals respond when certainty replaces belief. It illustrates why people pursue answers even when they fear them, why people regret taking DNA tests, yet still demand them, and why the concept of justice in jurisprudence must balance firmness with humanity. This case stands as a reminder that courts are not places of storytelling, but places of record. Stories may lead people to file cases, but evidence determines outcomes. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom once again demonstrates how the law functions as a stabilizing force in emotionally charged disputes, ensuring that decisions are grounded in fact rather than feeling. In the end, the court does what it is designed to do. It identifies truth, applies the law, and steps aside. What remains is the responsibility of each individual to rebuild their understanding of themselves and their relationships in light of that truth. That is where the law ends and personal accountability begins, a boundary that defines the enduring, sometimes uncomfortable but essential relationship between law and justice.